I have buried 3 people in my life. My father, who died the way he lived, quietly, without making a fuss, in his favorite armchair with a cup of cold coffee and the evening news on. My wife, Margaret, who fought cancer for 2 years with the kind of stubborn, magnificent dignity that made every doctor in that hospital feel personally inadequate. And my son. Except my son wasn't dead, and I was the only person in that church who knew it. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. My name is James Hargrove. I am 67 years old. I have a bad left knee, a good bourbon collection, and what I can only describe as the single greatest poker face in the continental United States. I know this because I sat in the front pew of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church on a Thursday morning in October, in a black suit that Margaret had bought me for her own funeral, which is exactly the kind of woman she was, and I watched 200 people cry over my son's empty coffin. Empty, save for a microphone the size of a thumbnail sewn into the satin lining. And I didn't blink once. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about my son Ryan. Ryan Hargrove was 38 years old, 6'2", irritatingly handsome in the way that made people instinctively trust him before he'd said a word, which he had absolutely never in his life used unfairly, and I say that with only mild sarcasm. He built his company, Hargrove Capital Management, from a 2-desk office in downtown Chicago into a firm managing north of $400 million in private client assets. He did it in 11 years. He did it honestly. He did it with the same quiet, relentless focus his mother had and the same stubborn patience I apparently passed down. He called me every Sunday morning, without fail, 7:30, before the rest of his world woke up. He would call and we would talk about nothing important for 45 minutes, and it was genuinely the best part of my week. 8 months ago, those calls changed. Not dramatically. Ryan was too careful for dramatic. But I knew my son the way you know a house you've lived in for decades. You don't need to see the crack in the wall to know the foundation has shifted. You just feel it. Something in the air pressure. Something slightly wrong that you can't name yet. Then one Sunday he called at 6:15 instead of 7:30 and said without preamble, "Pop, I need to show you something. Can I come over?" He drove the 40 minutes from the city to my house in Evanston, sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and opened a folder that he set in front of me with the careful, deliberate energy of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally decided to put it down. "How long?" I asked, looking at the documents inside. 4 months of confirmed transfers, he said. Probably 6 of actual activity. I looked up at him. "Diane," I said, not a question. He nodded. "Now, I want to be precise about something. I never disliked my daughter-in-law, Diane, because she married my son. I disliked her because she was, from the moment I met her, the specific kind of person who performs warmth rather than feeling it. You know the type. The smile that arrives a half-second too deliberately. The affection that's always slightly more visible when there's an audience. The questions about your life that stop exactly at the depth where the answers might become inconvenient. Ryan had loved her, completely, foolishly, in the way good men love women who have correctly identified their particular variety of blind spot. They'd been married 6 years, no children, which Diane had always framed as a choice and which I had quietly suspected was a calculation. The man in the folder, the one moving money with Diane through a shell company incorporated in Delaware, his name was Scott Mercer, 35, financier, the kind of aggressively handsome that came with the specific confidence of someone who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. Ryan had been building the case for 4 months, quietly, alone. The way we Hargroves do things. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked. He looked at me across the table, and for just a moment, beneath the composure, I saw my son, the real one, the one who used to fall off his bike and refused to cry until he was around the corner and thought I couldn't see him, because I needed to be sure before I said it out loud, he said. Saying it out loud makes it real. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. We sat like that for a while. Then I said, "All right, so what's the plan?" And my son, my brilliant, infuriating, magnificent son, smiled for the first time since he'd walked through my door. "Pop," he said, "I'm going to need you to come to my funeral. I want to describe to you the specific experience of watching your son rehearse being dead." The plan was Ryan's, architected over 3 weeks with the help of 2 people. His attorney, a sharp woman named Carol Wen, who had the energy of someone who had been waiting her whole career for exactly this kind of case, and a physician named Dr. Marcus Webb, who had been Ryan's college roommate, who owed Ryan a favor of a vintage I was not made privy to, and who had the calm, unflappable demeanor of a man who found the whole thing professionally interesting. The medical piece was elegant, in a cold sort of way, a compound that lowered Ryan's vitals to levels consistent with cardiac death. Temporary, controlled, reversible. Dr. Webb would certify the death. The funeral home director, a third-generation man named Harold Finch, who had known our family for 30 years, and who accepted the situation with the practiced, sorrowful professionalism of someone who had seen genuinely everything, would handle the rest. The coffin had 4 things inside it that a normal coffin does not: a concealed oxygen supply, a body temperature regulator, a heart monitor transmitting to Dr. Webb's phone, and the microphone. Ryan needed Diane and Scott to say something incriminating, in a space that could be reasonably construed as private, that would add to an already substantial but not yet airtight financial case. He needed them comfortable, confident, grieving in the way people grieve when they're mostly relieved. They'll talk, Ryan told me, 3 days before. People like Scott always talk. He won't be able to help himself. He'll want to perform. He'll want her to see him being powerful at my funeral. You know this man well, I said. I know men who think they've won, Ryan said. Same thing. My job, my one singular critical job, was to sit in that front pew, in Margaret's suit, and grieve convincingly. I practiced in the mirror twice and decided I was overthinking it. I had 30 years of faculty meetings and neighborhood HOA disputes, and one particularly brutal Thanksgiving where Margaret's sister brought her new boyfriend who sold cryptocurrency. I could sit still and look devastated. I had range. The service was at 11. St. Matthew's was full by 10:45. Ryan had been well liked, genuinely, broadly, the way people are liked when they've spent a decade doing business honestly in a city that doesn't always reward it. There were colleagues, clients, neighbors, golf friends. 3 people I didn't recognize who cried more than anyone, and whom I later discovered were from Ryan's regular Thursday lunch spot, and apparently he'd been quietly paying one of the waitress's daughter's college tuition for 2 years, which I found out at the reception, and which absolutely destroyed me in a way the fake funeral had not. Diane sat 2 seats away from me in the front pew, dressed in the precise calibration of widow's black, tasteful, expensive, just grief-stricken enough. She had cried at the right moments during the eulogy. She had gripped the arm of Ryan's cousin Amanda with convincing sorrow. She was, I will grudgingly admit, a committed performer. Scott Mercer sat 4 rows back. Dark suit, respectful expression, the carefully manufactured distance of a man who is pretending he's barely an acquaintance when everyone in a certain circle knows better. He caught my eye once and gave me the solemn, sympathetic nod of a man who wanted to be read as decent. I nodded back. I thought, enjoy the next 10 minutes. The service ended at 12:40. The receiving line moved through. People pressed my hand and said the things people say. He was so young. He was so good. You must be so proud, if there's anything we can do. And I received every one of them with the dignity of a man whose son is definitely, absolutely, 100% dead in the box 6 feet away. The crowd thinned. And then it was just family, which at this point meant Diane, her sister Patricia, Ryan's cousin Amanda, an uncle named Roy who had driven in from Indianapolis and smelled powerfully of menthol cigarettes, and Scott Mercer, who had no business being in the inner circle, but had somehow migrated forward with the confident inevitability of a man used to occupying spaces he hasn't been invited into. I stood at the coffin with my hand resting on the wood, talking to my son, like a grieving father does. I could feel the room behind me, the quiet shuffle of people respecting the moment, giving me space, and then I felt him before I heard him. The specific displacement of air that precedes a tall man leaning close. The faint, expensive cologne, the warmth of a voice pitched deliberately low, meant only for me. Scott Mercer leaned over my shoulder, and he said it. Don't worry, old man. His voice carried the particular satisfaction of a man who has wanted to say something for a very long time. I'll spend his millions better than he did. I kept my hand on the coffin. I kept my eyes forward. I counted to 3. And from inside the polished mahogany box, in the absolute silence of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, my son coughed, not a dramatic cough, not a movie cough, A short, involuntary, physiologically inevitable response to a respiratory system coming back online approximately 11 minutes ahead of schedule. Because Ryan Hargrove, and I cannot stress this enough, had apparently decided that lying still in a box, while Scott Mercer said something that infuriating, was a physical impossibility. The sound was small, but in that silence it was enormous. Scott Mercer stopped breathing, and I, God help me, smiled. Not big, just a small, private, unhurried smile, still looking straight ahead, my hand still on the coffin lid. Scott, I said quietly. He made a sound. You might want to stay right where you are. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you, genuinely. There is a specific kind of panic that is different from regular panic. Regular panic is loud. It flails. It knocks things over and says things it regrets, and breathes too fast in public spaces. Regular panic is, in its own way, manageable, because at least you can see it coming. The kind of panic I watched move through Scott Mercer in the 3 seconds after my son coughed from inside his own coffin was the other kind. The quiet kind. The kind that starts in the chest and moves outward in a cold, controlled wave. The kind that belongs to a man who has done something he cannot undo, and has just heard the sound of it catching up with him. He didn't scream, he didn't run, he just stopped. Every muscle, every breath, every carefully constructed expression of respectable grief. Just stopped. Like someone had found his power switch. I kept my hand on the coffin. I kept smiling my small, private, unhurried smile. And then the lid moved. Now, I want to paint this picture for you precisely, because the details matter and because I have replayed this moment in my mind approximately 400 times since it happened, and it is still, without question, the single greatest thing I have ever personally witnessed. The coffin lid didn't burst open. Ryan was too controlled for that. It rose, slowly, deliberately, the way a man opens a door when he wants everyone on the other side to have the full experience of what's coming. 1 inch, then 6. Then the lid was fully open, and my son was sitting up in his own casket in St. Matthew's Episcopal Church at 12:47 on a Thursday afternoon, his dark suit immaculate, his color returning in real time. His eyes finding Scott Mercer with the particular focus of a man who has had approximately 6 hours of horizontal thinking time to decide exactly where to look first. The sounds that came out of that room. Patricia, Diane's sister, screamed. A full, committed, boundary-pushing scream that I suspect she didn't entirely hate producing. Uncle Roy from Indianapolis said a word that should not be said in a church, and then immediately looked at the ceiling and mouthed an apology. Amanda, Ryan's cousin, burst into tears, which she later explained were the happiest tears of her life, though in the moment they were indistinguishable from the terrified variety. And Diane stood completely still, and her face did something that faces only do when every performance a person has ever maintained collapses simultaneously, like watching 6 years of careful architecture come down in 4 seconds. What was underneath was not grief. It was not love. It was not even anger. It was the cold, mechanical calculation of a woman rapidly assessing her options, which told you everything. Ryan looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough to confirm what he already knew. Then he looked away. Calmly. Finally, the way you look away from something you've been staring at too long. He swung his legs over the side of the coffin, accepted the arm of Dr. Marcus Webb, who had materialized from the side door with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been standing by for precisely this moment, and stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me. "Hey, Pop," he said. I looked at my son, standing upright, breathing, present, alive in every sense of the word. And I felt something move through me that I don't have adequate language for. Something that started somewhere behind my sternum and radiated outward with a warmth that made my bad left knee feel, briefly, absolutely fine. "You're late," I said. "You were supposed to wait for the signal." He had the audacity to look mildly sheepish. He said what he said. "Pop, I know what he said. So you understand. I understand you have no self-control. I was in a box. I'm aware you were in a box, Ryan. I watched them put you in it." He almost smiled. Then he turned around. The room had gone the specific quality of silent that happens when approximately 15 people are all trying to process the same impossible information simultaneously. Patricia had stopped screaming and was now simply standing with both hands pressed to her face, breathing through her fingers. Uncle Roy had sat down heavily in the nearest pew and appeared to be having a private conversation with the Lord. Amanda was still crying, but had begun laughing inside the crying, which is its own remarkable sound. And Scott Mercer. Scott Mercer had not moved. I want to give him this much. He had more composure than I expected. A lesser man would have bolted for the door the moment the lid started rising. Scott had the survival intelligence to understand, in that first horrible second, that bolting would be the worst thing he could do. So he stood, rooted, with the expression of a man who has decided his best remaining strategy is to look like he has no idea what's happening. It was not convincing. Ryan walked toward him slowly, not aggressively, not with heat, with the measured, unhurried calm of a man who has all the time in the world because the hard part is already done. He stopped about 3 feet away. The two men looked at each other, and Ryan said, pleasantly, "Scott." Scott said nothing. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Ryan said. Still nothing. "That's all right," Ryan said. "You don't have to say anything. You've already said everything that matters." He tilted his head slightly. "About 11 minutes ago." Into a microphone. The color left Scott Mercer's face so completely and so quickly that it was genuinely medically notable. Dr. Webb actually glanced at him with brief professional interest. "I don't," Scott started. "The satin lining," Ryan said helpfully. "Left side about 3 inches from the pillow. Good microphone, actually. Carol picked it. She has excellent taste in surveillance equipment." He paused. "And attorneys." As if summoned by her name, which knowing Carol Wen was not entirely out of the question. The side door of the church opened, and Carol walked in. Sharp blazer, flat expression, a leather document case under one arm, and the energy of a woman arriving exactly on time to a meeting she scheduled 3 weeks ago. She was followed by 2 other people, a man and a woman, both in dark coats, both with the specific posture and the specific quality of eye contact that announces a profession before any badge is shown. They didn't rush, they didn't make a production of it. They simply walked in and positioned themselves with the quiet geographical certainty of people who know exactly which exit matters. Scott Mercer looked at them. He looked back at Ryan. He looked at the door. "I wouldn't," I said from behind him, pleasantly. He turned to look at me, and I saw it happen. The final, comprehensive collapse of the strategy. The moment a man realizes that the thing he thought he was winning was never actually a competition. It was a procedure. And the procedure was complete. Carol set her document case on the front pew and opened it with the efficiency of a surgeon laying out instruments. "Scott Mercer," she said, without looking up. "These are federal wire fraud charges, filed this morning in the Northern District of Illinois. These," she produced a second set of documents, "are the civil asset freeze orders covering the Delaware entity, the 2 Cayman accounts, and the brokerage account opened in February under your mother's maiden name." Which was creative, I'll give you that. It didn't work, but it was creative. Scott stared at the documents. "There's also," Carol continued, with the particular mild tone of someone saving the best for last, "a separate filing regarding the $412,000 moved in September, which your attorney will tell you crossed a threshold that makes this substantially less of a civil matter and substantially more of a federal one." She closed the document case. "But I'm sure you knew that." The 2 people in dark coats had moved to positions that were not aggressive, but were geometrically very deliberate. Scott turned to Diane, and this moment was the one I had not anticipated, because the look he gave her was not the look of a co-conspirator looking for backup. It was the look of a man who has just realized he is alone in a way he had not previously understood himself to be. "Diane," he said, and his voice for the first time all morning had lost every layer of performance. What was underneath was younger than I expected, more frightened. "Diane, you need to call Richard." Diane looked at Scott for a long moment, a look I could not fully read. Then she opened her purse, took out her phone, and began dialing. Not Richard. Ryan watched her dial. Something moved through his eyes. Not vindication exactly. Something quieter than that. Sadder, if I'm being precise. "She's calling her own attorney," Carol said to Ryan quietly, appearing at his shoulder. "Separate representation. She agreed to that 3 days ago." "Cooperation agreement?" I asked Carol, keeping my voice low. Carol glanced at me with the mild expression of someone professionally obligated not to confirm things to non-attorneys. "Pop," Ryan said, "I'm just asking." "I know what you're asking. She's still the mother of your—" "She's not pregnant, Pop." I stopped. He said it without looking at me, still watching the room, still composed. Just a quiet statement of fact, delivered the way my son delivered all the hardest facts, directly, without cushioning, because he had learned from watching me that cushioning hard facts was just a way of making them last longer. Diane told me 4 months ago, he said. That was the first thing. Before I found the transfers, before I found Scott, she told me she was pregnant, and I started. He paused briefly. I wanted to believe it. I did everything you do when you believe something. And then I found out she wasn't, had never been. It was a strategy to buy time, to keep me emotionally. He stopped again. To keep me still. I stood next to my son in the church where we had pretended to bury him, and I thought about Margaret, and about the Sunday morning phone calls, and about all the ways a person can be loved badly by someone they loved well. I put my hand on his arm. He covered it briefly with his own hand, just for a second. Then he straightened. Scott was escorted out at 1:15. He walked between the two federal agents with the diminished, slightly bewildered quality of a man whose body hasn't yet caught up with what his mind already knows. At the door he turned back. I don't know what he was looking for. Some final thing. Some version of this that made sense. He found Ryan watching him calmly from the front of the church. And Ryan said, across the full length of St. Matthew's Episcopal, in a voice that was even and clear and entirely without malice, I hope you spend the next few years thinking about what you actually wanted, Scott. Because it wasn't the money. People who actually want money are usually smarter about how they take it. Scott stared at him. Whatever it was, Ryan said, I hope you figure it out. The doors closed. The room breathed. Uncle Roy, still sitting in his pew, cleared his throat. Is anyone going to explain to me, he said carefully, what in the entire Lord's creation I just watched? Amanda, still laughing inside the crying, put her arm around him. Roy, she said, it's a long story. I found Ryan standing alone by the coffin 20 minutes later, when the room had mostly cleared and Carol was making calls in the vestibule and Dr. Webb had diplomatically taken everyone else for coffee across the street. He was just standing there looking at it, his hand resting on the edge, almost exactly the way mine had been resting when Scott had leaned in. I stood beside him. We were quiet for a while. How do you feel? I asked. He thought about it honestly, which is the only way Hargroves answer that question. Like I've been in a box for 6 hours, he said. You have been in a box for 6 hours. Yeah, a pause. Also like. He stopped, started again. You know when you've been carrying something so long you forget you're carrying it, and then you put it down? Yes, I said. I know exactly what that feels like. He nodded. We stood there a while longer, father and son, in an empty church on a Thursday afternoon, next to the coffin that had held everything that needed to end so that everything else could begin. Sunday, I said finally, 7:30. You're calling. He looked at me. I don't care what's happening, I said. I don't care if there are attorneys and federal proceedings and whatever else Carol has scheduled. 7:30 Sunday, you call. My son looked at me for a long moment with Margaret's eyes and my jaw, and 38 years of Sunday morning phone calls and everything that meant. Yeah, Pop, he said quietly. I'll call. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. There are things you think you know, and then there are things you know. The distance between those two things is where most of life's genuine surprises live, the good ones and the devastating ones alike. I have lived 67 years, and I can tell you with complete authority that the moments that actually change you are never the ones you prepared for. They are always, without exception, the ones that arrive quietly, from a direction you weren't watching, wearing a face you thought you recognized. I thought the story ended when Scott Mercer walked out of St. Matthew's in federal custody. I thought the hard part was behind us. I was wrong on both counts, and the person who corrected me was the last person on earth I expected. It started with a phone call. Not Sundays. This was the Friday morning after the funeral, 7:42 a.m., before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. Ryan's name on the screen. I answered immediately. Pop. His voice had that quality again, the one from 8 months ago, the one that had brought him to my kitchen table with an untouched coffee and a folder full of damage. I need you to come into the city. What happened? Carol got a call last night from Diane's attorney, and a pause that lasted long enough to tell me that whatever came next was going to require me to sit down. She wants to meet, he said. Diane does. Not the attorneys. Just her and me. And she's asking that you be there. I set down my coffee cup. She's asking for me specifically? She said, and Carol wrote this down because Carol writes everything down. She said, I need James there. He's the only one who will understand what I'm about to say. I stood in my kitchen in Evanston for a long moment, looking out the window at the November yard, the oak tree Margaret had planted the year Ryan was born. The bird feeder I kept filling out of habit, even though I couldn't tell you the last time I'd actually watched the birds. What time? I said. We met at Ryan's office downtown. Neutral territory, or as neutral as a man's own office can be, which is to say, not particularly neutral at all, but it was the address Diane had suggested which told its own quiet story. Hargrove Capital Management occupied the 14th floor of a building on Wacker Drive, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Chicago River, that Margaret had loved extravagantly and visited every chance she got. The office was quiet on a Friday morning. Skeleton staff, given the week's events. Carol was present, positioned at the corner of the conference table with her legal pad and her flat expression and the specific energy of a woman who has agreed to observe without participating and is finding it professionally challenging. Ryan sat at the head of the table. I sat to his right. Diane came in at 9 o'clock exactly. She looked different from the funeral, not disheveled. Diane was constitutionally incapable of disheveled. But the performance was gone. The careful calibration of expression, the precise temperature of warmth, the widow's black, all of it stripped away. What walked into that conference room was just a woman, tired, carrying something, older somehow than she had looked 24 hours ago. She sat down across from Ryan. She looked at me. Thank you for coming, James, she said. You asked? I said. She nodded. Then she folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. And when she looked up, what was in her eyes was something I had not, in 6 years of watching this woman perform every variety of human emotion, ever seen there before. It was shame. Real shame, the kind that doesn't have an audience. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Both of you. Ryan said nothing. I said nothing. She took a breath. My maiden name, she said carefully, is Diane Smith. The room was quiet. My father's name was Richard Smith. He ran a small private investment fund in Indianapolis through the 90s and early 2000s. 40 clients, retirement savings mostly. Teachers, nurses, a few small business owners. She paused. In 2006, the fund collapsed. All 40 clients lost everything. My father was indicted for securities fraud. She looked at Ryan. The expert witness who testified against him, she said, was a forensic financial analyst retained by the prosecution. She slid a photograph across the table. It was old, printed on the kind of matte paper that dates a document immediately, 20 years thick with it. A courtroom photograph, the kind journalists take from the gallery. A man on the stand, mid-testimony, confident and clear and doing what he did best. I recognized the man immediately. I had recognized him every morning for 67 years. In the mirror, shaving. Ryan picked up the photograph. He looked at it. He looked at me. I sat very, very still. I need to stop here and tell you something about 2006 that I have never told my son. The Smith case was not the biggest case I worked in 30 years of forensic financial analysis. It was not the most complex, or the highest profile, or the one that made careers. Mine was already made by then. It was, professionally speaking, a straightforward matter. The fraud was real. The documentation was clear. My testimony was accurate. And Richard Smith went to prison for 7 years. I have never lost a night of sleep over my testimony. The fraud was real. I stand behind every word I said. What I had not known, what the prosecution had not briefed me on, what existed only in the human details that legal proceedings have a way of grinding down to irrelevance, was that Richard Smith had a daughter, 17 years old in 2006, a junior in high school in Indianapolis, a girl who lost her college fund, her childhood home, and her father in the same calendar year. A girl who had apparently spent the following 16 years building something. I looked at Diane across the conference table. How long? I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. How long had you been planning this? I found out who you were 3 years before I met Ryan, she said. I found out about Ryan, about the company, the assets, about a year after that. She held my gaze. I started planning the approach about 18 months before the conference in Cincinnati. Ryan made a sound, not a word, just a sound, quiet, involuntary. The kind that comes out of a person when something hits a place that was not armored because they never thought to armor it there. I kept looking at Diane. The original plan, she said, and her voice was steady in the way that very carefully controlled things are steady, was the company, the assets. I was going to take what I calculated my father's clients had lost, adjusted for what his fund would have returned over 20 years, and I was going to leave. She paused. That was the plan. Was, Ryan said. His voice was quiet, precise, past tense. She looked at him, and here is where Diane Smith did the thing I had not prepared for. The thing that no version of this story I had run in my mind had included. Her composure. That immaculate load-bearing composure that had held through a fake funeral and a federal proceeding, and the complete structural collapse of a 6-year plan. Cracked. Not dramatically. Just a single visible fracture. A tightening around her eyes. A breath that didn't come out evenly. I didn't plan on you, she said to Ryan. Directly, quietly. I didn't plan on any of... She stopped. You're not what I expected. You were never what I expected. Ryan said nothing. I know that doesn't matter, she said quickly. I know what I did. I know what I took. I know that nothing I say in this room changes the charges or the cooperation agreement, or any of it. She looked down at her hands briefly. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm not. That's not what this is. Then what is it? Ryan asked. She looked at me. I needed him to know, she said, that it started with him, not with you. I needed that to be in the room, on the record, with witnesses, because you spending the rest of your life thinking you were the target is... She stopped again. Drew a careful breath. You weren't the target. You were never supposed to be anything except a mechanism. And then you. Another stop. Longer this time. Ryan looked at the photograph in his hand. His own father, 20 years younger, on a witness stand, doing his job. He set it down on the table. He looked at Diane for a very long time. When he spoke, his voice was even. Not cold. Not warm. Something else. Something that exists in the specific register of a person who is feeling too many things simultaneously to let any single one take the lead. Did you love me? He said. Any of it. Any point. The question sat in the middle of that conference table between them like something fragile. Diane looked at him, and for the first time in 6 years I believed every word she was about to say before she said it. Yes, she said. Simply. Without performance. Without architecture. Not at first, but yes. Carol, to her considerable professional credit, did not write that part down. Ryan and I drove back to Evanston together that afternoon. He didn't want to be in the city. I didn't ask questions. He just appeared at my passenger door, and I drove, the way I had driven him places his whole life. The way driving has always been the Hargrove substitute for the kinds of conversations that are too large for stationary rooms. We were on the highway for about 15 minutes before he said anything. Did you know? He said. About her father, about the case. Not until she put that photograph on the table, I said. He nodded slowly. If you had known, he said, when you met her, if someone had told you who she was. I thought about it honestly. I would have told you, I said, and then I would have watched you make your own decision. He was quiet for a while. What decision would I have made? He said. Half to me, half to the window. I don't know, I said, but I think the decision would have been the same. Because the thing that made her dangerous to you, Ryan, the thing she used, was real. On both sides. That doesn't disappear because the context was wrong. He didn't say anything for a long time after that. Then, she was 17, Pop. I know. When you testified. She was 17 years old and you put her father in prison. I testified accurately. I said. Her father committed a real crime against real people. I know that, he said. I know. He pressed his fingers briefly to his eyes. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying she was 17. And that's... He exhaled. That's a long time to carry something. Yes, I said quietly. It is. We drove. The city fell away behind us. The lake appeared and disappeared between buildings, and then we were in Evanston, and I pulled into my driveway, and we sat for a moment in the parked car the way we sat on the phone every Sunday. Present. Quiet. Not needing the silence to be filled. What happens to her? He asked. That's Carol's world, I said. Cooperation agreement, reduced charges probably. She gave them Scott completely. She gave them the Delaware entity, the offshore structure, the whole architecture. Just precise. She built it, I agreed. And she handed it over. He nodded. We got out of the car and went inside, and I made coffee. And Ryan sat at the same kitchen table where he'd sat 8 months ago with an untouched cup and a folder full of damage. Except this time he drank the coffee, both hands wrapped around the mug, present. "Pop," he said. I'm going to be all right." I looked at my son across my kitchen table. 38 years old, sitting in the house where he grew up, in the room where his mother had quizzed him on homework and argued about curfews, and loved him with a consistency that neither of them ever fully articulated because they didn't need to. "I know you are," I said, and I meant it the way you mean things when you have watched a person be built, when you have seen every version of them, the broken ones and the whole ones and every iteration in between, and you know, with a certainty that has nothing to do with optimism, and everything to do with evidence, that they are made of something that bends, but doesn't break. "Sunday," I said. 7:30. He looked up. "Don't be late," I said. He called it 7:28, 2 minutes early, which for Ryan was the equivalent of arriving the night before. I was already at the kitchen table. Coffee made, morning light doing what it does in November, coming in low and long and golden through the window over the sink. Margaret's oak tree throwing its last leaves across the yard. The bird feeder full. I answered on the first ring. "Hey, Pop. Hey, son." And we talked for 45 minutes about nothing important. Which was everything. Scott Mercer pled guilty 14 months later to federal wire fraud and conspiracy charges. He received 4 years in a minimum security facility in Indiana, which his attorney characterized as a victory, which tells you everything you need to know about the case against him. Diane Smith cooperated fully with federal prosecutors. Her cooperation agreement resulted in reduced charges, 18 months of supervised release, full financial restitution, and a permanent bar from securities-related work. She moved back to Indianapolis. Ryan sent her a letter 6 months after the trial. I don't know what it said. I didn't ask. He didn't offer. Some things belong only to the people there between. Hargrove Capital Management did not collapse, did not shrink, did not flinch. Ryan spent the 6 months following the funeral rebuilding what had been drained, quietly, methodically, the way we Hargroves do things. And by the following spring the firm was stronger than it had been before any of it started. Several of his clients sent handwritten notes when the news broke. One of them, a retired teacher from Oak Park who had been a client for 9 years, sent a casserole. Ryan called me the night the casserole arrived and said, with genuine bewilderment, "A woman sent me a lasagna, Pop." "That's what people do," I said. "Why? Because they don't know what else to do and they want to do something. It's the highest form of sincerity." A pause. "It's actually really good lasagna," he said. "Then write her a note," I said. "Tomorrow. By hand." He did. I think about Richard Smith sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. A man who made real choices that caused real harm, who paid a real price, who left behind a 17-year-old girl in a house that was no longer hers, with a future that had been rewritten by his decisions, and then again 16 years later by her own. I think about the distance between justice and consequence, how they overlap imperfectly, how the right thing and the complete thing are almost never exactly the same shape. I think about my son sitting up in his own casket. I think about Scott Mercer's face in the moment before the lid rose, the specific private terror of a man who had leaned over a grieving father at a funeral and decided in that moment of confident cruelty that he was the most powerful person in the room. He was not the most powerful person in the room. He was never close. "My name is James Hargrove. I am 67 years old with a bad left knee and a good bourbon collection, and an oak tree in my yard that my wife planted the year our son was born. I have buried 2 people I loved. I have watched my son climb out of a coffin in a church on a Thursday afternoon and straighten his jacket and say, 'Hey, Pop,' like he hadn't just given me the single greatest moment of my entire life. I have sat across a conference table from a woman who spent 16 years building a weapon out of her grief, aimed it at my family, and somewhere in the middle of pulling the trigger, chose differently. I have learned at 67 that the stories you think you know the ending of are always the ones still being written. And I have learned, or maybe remembered because Margaret tried to tell me this for 30 years, that the most important things are almost never the dramatic ones. They are not the courtroom moments or the coffin moments or the federal proceeding moments. They are the Sunday morning phone calls. They are the 45 minutes about nothing. They are the lasagna from a retired teacher in Oak Park who wanted to do something and didn't know what else to do. They are the bird feeder you keep filling, even though you can't tell you the last time you watched the birds. until one morning you look up, and there they are. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.